Okay, so my name is Richard Campbell. That's my Twitter handle, the easiest way to reach me. You may be aware I make a few podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Couple? Okay. Thank you for listening. A number of years ago, my friend Carl Franklin talked me into making a show about space stuff on .NET Rocks. The way it happened was this. We were on the phone together. We were not recording it, which is unusual. And it was when Atlantis was landing for the very last time in 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis. And I went on about a 25-minute rant about everything that was wrong with the Space Shuttle. I was a little angry that day. And Carl said, we should have recorded that. And I said, why? He said, I don't think a lot of people know. And he's like, whatever. So he taught, and then he's like, we should let's make a show about that and other space stuff that you care about. And I thought it was a really bad idea. But he talked me into it. And when we published it, the response was, could you talk about space elevators? Could you talk about, Chinese space program? And to me, that means, okay, they didn't mind it. It wasn't stay in your lane, talk about ASP.NET. It was talk about this stuff more. So we started making geek outs on a regular basis. There's about 80 or 90 of them now. So if you go to the .NET Rocks site, you can actually filter by geek out subjects, and it will give you the list of them. These are basically subjects that I'm interested in, which turns out to be a lot of things. So there's a bunch of space-oriented geek outs. There's a number of alternative energy geek outs, as well as things like whiskey and barbecue and beer. And I did one on antibiotics just to challenge myself. I had read a couple of papers on teixobactins, which is a new generation antibiotic. I'm like, can I put together a good hour on that? So I actually crammed antibiotics from medical references. Got it good enough that I made the medical guy angry because he said, well, I've always wondered if you were just making all this stuff up for geek outs. And I'm like, but that's actually my field. I'm like, how did I do? And he goes, you nailed it. And that really pisses me off. I'm like, okay, well, it was hard work. The most emotional one of them all for me was the nuclear weapons one. I think it took me a week to shake that one off. My wife was quite distressed. But the space ones are fun. And some crazy things have come from doing these geek outs. So I did this, I read a paper, it was a European Space Agency paper about a proposal to put bases on the moon. They're completely serious that the technology's advanced to a point where it would make sense for European Space Agency to establish a base on the moon, very much like Antarctica, that scientists would rotate out in the kind of lab experiments they wanted to do and so on. And I thought, that's pretty cool. Let's go see what the Americans are doing and sort of put together notes. And that led to this moon-based geek out. Published that in the March of 2017. And that summer, NASA called, which is weird. Actually, they emailed first, but I didn't believe it was real. Sure, NASA.gov, whatever. But after a few emails, it seemed very credible. So I got the guy on the phone. His name was Chuck. And he's like, hey, we really like your podcast about the moon. I'm like, thanks. NASA guys are listening to my talk on the moon. Have you ever considered, would you do a presentation on it? Because he just thinks I'm a podcast. He doesn't know. I'm like, yeah, I could do a presentation on it. Have you ever used PowerPoint? Because we like PowerPoint at NASA. Yeah, Chuck, I could probably use PowerPoint. He's like, well, would you be considered, we pay your way. Would you do a talk for us on the moon? I'm like, you want me to talk to you about the moon? Yeah. It's your stuff, right? Like, I'm talking about your stuff. He goes, yeah. So that's fall. I got to go to the Ames Research Center. And let me tell you, Mom was pretty proud. You drive up to a NASA Research Center and the entryway banner says, Richard Campbell. Well, it was good for me. I don't know how good it'd be for you, but if it's good for me, and I talked to a bunch of guys who put stuff on the moon about putting stuff on the moon. That's not what this talk's about at all. This talk is sort of this current state of affairs for space flight. So talk a bit about the current generation of rockets that are being developed and have been developed. The state of the space station, because we are coming to an inflection point with the International Space Station, and the current activity around putting people back onto the moon. So that's what we can probably hammer through in about an hour. Let's talk a little bit about space tourism, because last year was sort of a kickoff year in a lot of respects, and you probably saw this first manned flight of Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two. This was originally Burt Rutan's project, funded by the late Paul Allen, to make a low-cost vehicle that could go suborbital, just above the Kármán line and back. Flight profile is pretty straightforward. They have a larger vehicle called White Knight 2 that carries the spaceship up to roughly around 40,000 feet, and then they drop it. The rocket motor ignites. It's an unusual rocket motor in that it's a solid propellant motor. It's kind of a rubbery material that they spray nitrous oxide on. So it's actually a throttleable solid motor, which is interesting. And they get a boost up to roughly around 100 kilometers, just more or less above the Kármán line. And then it returns, and that's where the clever bit comes in, where they call them the feathers, the wings bend upward to give it a stable profile to re-enter, spirals down and lands. Takes about 15 minutes to get to altitude with the White Knight, and then it's about a 1.5-minute burn, followed by 4 minutes return, all yours for $250,000. There hasn't been another flight since the one that Branson took. The one that's flown more is Bezos's New Shepard, a fully reusable rocket, but a suborbital rocket, but very much the same sort of profile, much shorter trip all in all. You get in your rocket, you fire it up in a span of about 3 minutes. You get to roughly the same altitude, about 100 kilometers. Separation. You get to bomb around, falling steadily the whole time, a little bit of free fall, about 2 minutes of free fall before you have to get back into your seat. The rocket lands back on the pad, and you parachute to Earth with a little burst of rocketry just before it lands to slow it down enough to make the landing comfortable. There's been several flights of this. They also run in the roughly the $200,000 category. So if you could have a very nice car or 3 minutes in space. And then there's the other billionaire. This guy. You may know him from such things as Twitter. But of all, and some of us like the Tesla cars. There's some other issues around those as well. But you can't argue about what SpaceX has accomplished. SpaceX is an extraordinary product. The Falcon 9 has a recoverable first stage booster that lands back on its tail either at the pad or on a floating barge, but it actually it does put vehicles into orbit. It's been resupplying the space station for a decade now, and now it's begun flying manned missions. The fourth one left like yesterday, giving the United States the ability to put humans back into space again after they gave it up in 2011 by retiring the Space Shuttle. Comparing the different vehicles, notice one's a teeny bit bigger than the other. And this is, folks don't necessarily get this until you show them the side by side. Getting up to 100 kilometers is not that hard. Going fast enough to stay there takes a bit more energy, and that's why New Shepard's a 20-meter rocket where Falcon 9 is a 70-meter rocket. There's a lot more fuel and force involved in making that work. But since Crew Dragon has been developed and validated, you can rent it out. It's about $100 million. And last year, we saw that happen when Jarek Eiserman, our resident billionaire, this is a billionaire's game, who's a bit of an adventurer. He currently holds the world record for shortest amount of time around the world in a single engine aircraft, rented out a Crew Dragon for a few days, and he brought some folks along. Sian was very merely a NASA astronaut. She missed final cut. She's been a science communicator. Jared always wraps his adventures in a charitable effort, and so he was supporting St. Jude's Hospital in the United States, and he raffled off one of the 4 tickets to that. The third person in this line, Haley Arsenault, is actually a woman who had cancer as a child and got treated at St. Jude's and then became a nurse practitioner at St. Jude's. Very cool woman. Loved that she was on there with her bone cancer took a part of her leg, and so she has artificial components in her leg, but she did that thing. And the guy that would be us if this happened at the end of the list there is Chris. Chris is a normal human. Now, he didn't actually win the contest. His friend won the contest and decided he didn't want to go and gave it to him. That's a good friend. We should all have friends like that. But he also is very much, he volunteers at space camp, things like that. He works for Lockheed Martin. And so these guys went into space. They really did. They took off the docking port on the end of the Crew Dragon and put a big plexiglass dome on it. This, of course, is a mock-up. Here's a picture of the actual thing in orbit. Few things we found out about actual tourists going into space. They were all brutally sick the entire time. They were in a room, you know, smaller than this stage, the four of them, with a toilet that leaked. And so they actually came down a couple days early. Like, and Chris was by far the worst. Like, I mean, Sienna had actually trained as an astronaut. Jared is a professional adventurer. I don't know how well Haley coped or not, but Chris had a tough time of it. Space is not easy, but can be yours for $100 million. You can share it with 3 of your friends. And just this past couple of weeks, we had the second tourism flight. This is Axios, or Axiom, and Axiom. These guys are pretty much all, well, Michael's a billionaire, Mark's a billionaire, I think Etienne's a billionaire as well. Larry's not, but he's a former astronaut, and I think Michael is a former astronaut as well. So these guys are pretty skilled. They could afford it. And yeah, they got a hop up. This time they were going to the space station. So Axiom is a company that's basically a bunch of ex-space station folks and some ex-astronauts. And so they've got a new generation of tourism flights. Again, it's roughly $100 billion, plus the expenses for the space station. The space station charges you somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000 a day for consuming resources, which was an interesting impact because these guys were supposed to be up with the regular crew for a week, and then they got weather delayed for another week, which is cool. I got 2 weeks on the space station and about a $200,000 bill because of it. So it's like, hey, you can't leave the hotel, but you get to pay per day for staying. But I mean, we really have tourism going on today, and mostly due to SpaceX's development with the Falcon 9. There are a number of other rockets under development. You may or may not have been following this. One of them is Bezos's first orbital rocket, which is a rocket called New Glenn. This has been in development for entirely too long. We have seen mock-ups of it, and that's about it. It's a 7-meter rocket that is considered extremely large. Falcon 9 is a sort of traditional size rocket. It's a 3.7-meter diameter rocket. He made it 3.7 meters across so that it would travel on highways successfully. He wanted to build them in California, and they needed to be delivered to Florida, and he didn't want to take them by ship. That's about as big as you can make it and still fit it on a truck. But it limits the payload. You can only carry so much on a 3.7-meter rocket. A 7-meter rocket is substantially more powerful. This is a rocket that I think Elon could easily build, but that's not what he's working on because he's crazy. Bezos has been working on this rocket for a really long time. First stage is supposed to be recoverable, same sort of thing, but it should be able to lift a quite substantial payload, be a tremendous rocket, and I hope it comes into being. I am losing hope. The traditional rocket makers, United Launch Alliance, that's a combination of Boeing and Lockheed Martin, are replacing their older rockets, the Atlas V and the Delta IV, with this rocket called Vulcan. And so it's using some Atlas V components, including the Centaur upper stage. The lower stage will be all new, 5 meters all the way along. So that's a fairly big rocket, not as big as what New Glenn would be. They took a dependency on Blue Origin, on Bezos' company, for these engines, the BE-4 engines. The same ones that are supposed to fly on New Glenn are supposed to fly Vulcan, and they are late. And then last but not least, we have the Space Launch System. So Space Launch is NASA's repurposing of Space Shuttle technology. So that's why it's orange with the solid rocket boosters. Is very much, if you got a shuttle empty, is about 100 tons. And you strap it to the side of the rocket, which is a really bad idea. Don't do that. But what if you eliminated that 100-ton weight you're carrying up into orbit and has to come back again, and just made everything disposable? So 4 Shuttle engines on the bottom, 2 extended length boosters. This in its current configuration will lift about 85 metric tons into low Earth orbit, which is an immense amount of lift. In more advanced versions, it would lift more. And if you've followed this, this is a picture from the fueling tests that happened just the past couple of weeks. It went very poorly. Not catastrophically, as in they would have lost the vehicle, but as in caused leaks, very nearly exploded, very nearly killed some folks on the ground. They fully defueled it and taken it back to the vehicle assembly building for repairs. It's taken them 20 years to this point. It's not going well. This would have been a very cool rocket in like 1999, and now it just looks fairly archaic. The model they're working on is this Block 1, about 87 metric tons worth of lift with the Centaur upper stage. There are some modifications they want to make to increase capacity that would allow them to fly payloads to the moon. It's Boeing and Lockheed Martin, right? NASA doesn't build anything. They contract it all out. It's really the structure of the contract that matters. And so the problem that NASA has run into in the past is that most of their contracts, like most military contracts in America, are what they call cost-plus contracts. So that is, we will pay whatever it costs you to do this thing because it's new and original and unique, and we will give you bonuses for being on time and making certain milestones and reliability metrics. And so if it works, you make extra money, but you always get all your costs paid. So there's really no incentive to go too quickly or to take any chances or to improve anything. And that's the trap they get into. They make the same thing over and over again. The Atlas V rocket has flown more than 100 times. It has never failed. It's also $25,000 US per kilo into orbit and has been the whole time. And the Falcon 9 is about 2,000 a kilo. So what's changed is that NASA started doing different kinds of contracts. The COTS contracts to supply resources to the space station were priced per kilo. They said, we'll pay this much per kilo into orbit. How much you spend, up to you. We need this much uplift and we need this much downlift. Go. And so what happened with companies like SpaceX and with Orbital Sciences, the ones who fly the Cygnus resupply into the space station, is that they kept improving their rocket and reducing their costs while still collecting the same amount of money per kilo. It saved NASA money, but it made those companies also profitable. They were properly incented by their contracts. So this is what the bad contract looks like versus Falcon 9 with the right contract. And then there's this crazy thing. Anybody been following Starship? So this is Elon's folly. This is a 9-meter rocket. The only thing larger than this was the first stage of the Saturn V, which was a 10-meter rocket. The goal is a 100% reusable rocket. So it has a lower stage that would return on its tail like the Falcon 9 does, and an upper stage that would be a complete boost into orbit, working payload, reentry, and landing system. And we know that they've built a full stack and have been experimenting with the system for a while. To get it, again, for a scope here of just how big we're talking about when we talk about Starship, it is a massive vehicle. It is substantially larger than the Saturn V. It is substantially larger than any of these others. It's wider, it's heavier, and in theory, it's fully reusable. Except for that part where it doesn't work, it's awesome. So yeah, you would have arguably the most powerful set of engines firing simultaneously, 33 of them at last count. There's a whole bunch of conversation about how much acoustic damage that's going to do, blowing big holes in the ground when it does it. To push this enormous rocket to that lower stage would burn for about 2.5 minutes, and then it would separate, turn around, fly back, land on its pad. To save the weight on landing gear, his intent is to catch that booster with a pair of arms. Because that's not nuts. He's built it, but he's currently under FAA restrictions to actually fly it. So they're waiting to finish an FAA review, which just got bumped out another month to do the first test flights for it. The upper stage then goes into orbit, and when it comes back, it re-enters on its belly, much like the space station did. It has a set of heat shields on it. Then it decelerates, does free fall down to about 250 kilometers per hour, and then just above the ground, fires the engines, pivots back on its tail, and lands on its tail. And he's talking about catching those with this one with the arms too, because why not? The only thing you can say in favor of Elon, at least he does all this stuff in public. Like, if you want to go onto YouTube and watch Starship being developed, you can see him doing the experiments to fly it up and bring it back down and land it on its tail. It's an opportunity to watch a lot of stuff explode, but he sticks the landing once. And he continues to iterate. What's clever about Elon's approach is that he's focused on the manufacturing. He keeps making them and improving and iterating. He is doing agile rocket development. By being willing to bend metal and try. It's such a contrast to the way you watch a lot of other aerospace development going on. SLS has been in development for years and years and years. One would argue they haven't spent enough money, but now they finally get to the point where they're testing the first rocket and they're having all the same kind of failures that they would have had anyway. So why not do this rapid iteration model? It doesn't seem to be any less less reliable than the other approaches. But here's the math. So if we go back to the Saturn V, which hasn't flown since 1974, still has the largest payload. We have nothing that can take the kind of payloads that a fully loaded Saturn V are capable of. And its rough price per kilogram, there's some fudging here for dealing with inflation and so forth, but the Saturn V was relatively cost effective. Compared to the Space Shuttle, arguably the least cost effective spacecraft ever built. Sir? Those are so the payload is in kilograms, and then the price per kilo. That price of $65,000 a kilogram is the all-up price for the Space Shuttle. Now that the program has ended, they were taking all the development costs, all the production costs, and all of the operating costs combined, so that's an all-up price. Dan Golden, who was the NASA administrator at the time in 2011, said, if we had taken the same amount of money that we spent on Space Shuttle over this duration and had just continued to fly Apollo, it would have been 6 missions a year, including 2 to the moon, the whole time. The goal of the Space Shuttle was ambitious, to have an easily reusable spacecraft. They failed. It didn't work. It still did remarkable things, but it never achieved the goal it was supposed to do. The fastest they ever used a shuttle was twice in a year. It was supposed to be weekly. They were supposed to last for 100 flights each. The one that flew the most flew 34 times, and they lost 2. So, and arguably, again, they didn't spend enough money on it. I didn't bother listing an Atlas V, but they come in at about $25,000 a kilo. The Falcon 9 at $2,600 a kilo is the least expensive, routinely operational rocket. That's why there'll be more Falcon 9s flown this year than all the other rockets in the world combined. Because if you have a choice of how to transport a load into space, you will fly SpaceX. It's that much cheaper. And so all commercial payloads that are allowed to fly on American rockets do. They've just eaten the market, for better or worse, because they've earned it. The Falcon Heavy is strapping 3 Falcon 9s together. If you get ever a chance to see one, go. It should be a heck of a show. It has certain problems. The main thing is it doesn't have enough space in its payload fairing to carry the payload that it's capable of. It's more powerful than the space that it can store in. The Falcon 9 is kind of tapped out as a rocket platform. There's a rule in rocketry called the Fineness Ratio. It's basically the limit of how long you can make a rocket versus its width. The typical ratio is 15 to 1. So you can be 15 times taller than your width. The Falcon 9 is 18 to 1. It is already too long. There's a thing called angular moments, with basically flexing of the rocket because it's so long. And while they've never lost a rocket that way, that is a genuine risk. So they feel like they've done as much as they can with Falcon 9. So in theory, the payload capacity of a Falcon Heavy is about 50 metric tons fully reusable. Well, the lower stage is fully reusable. They've never even come close to lifting that much because they can't fit 50 metric tons in the payload fairing they have. The payload fairings are too small. New Glenn has never flown, so those numbers are all fiction, but let's be optimistic. Vulcan has never flown. Again, be optimistic. Space Launch System has never flown. And neither is Starship, but look at the number, right? And why is the number so low? Because they're not throwing anything away. If it works as advertised, you do maintenance and fueling between flights. It's become an airliner, right? And Elon said this over and over again. What if you rode on an airplane to Australia and then they threw the airplane away, how much would that ticket be? Because that's essentially what we do with space flight. And so if he can actually build a fully reusable spacecraft, that changes everything. That then puts us in the range of you can go to orbit for a first-class airfare, right? It no longer becomes a toy of only billionaires. It's a once-in-a-lifetime trip for a regular human. And the price could go down from there. But that's the intent with Starship. And so, I mean, they're shooting high, sir. Yeah, well, I know about Soyuz. So Soyuz is the longest continuously operated rocket in the world. Well, the Soyuz platform. They have done several staged upgrades to the manned unit. It was cost effective because the ruble had a good exchange rate. It's at an exceptional exchange right now. You just can't buy any. And it's stunningly reliable rocket, although they recently had a failure that was a failure mode that had never occurred before, and the recovery system that saved the crew worked perfectly the first time it was ever used. So it's hard to measure because it comes down to you're paying in rubles, right? So we would have to pick an exchange rate. You used to be able to buy a seat on the Soyuz for about $25 million. They raised it, the last time that the NASA paid for it was $60 million. So that would arguably make the flight cost $180 million for a 3-seater. But I think there was some margin in that. We could probably get the price down. But yeah, it's a challenge on an exchange rate basis. All right, let's talk about the space station. We're kind of used to the idea that there's really only one space station because we spent a lot of money on this one. This is the most expensive, most complicated machine ever made by civilization so far. Rough estimates now, we spent $100 billion American dollars on this. It's not that America spent that much on it. A lot of countries have contributed to this. Generally speaking, not in forms of money, but in terms of resources. So modules built by the European Space Agency, modules built by JAXA, the Japanese agency, armed systems built by Canadians, because that's what we do best, and then significant Russian components and significant American components. The power system is American, the primary control system is Russian. Soyuz has brought almost all of the passengers to the space station. The shuttle brought a few. And now the Crew Dragon brings a few. Resupply, mostly done by Progress boosters, also Russian, and then there's there's the Cargo Dragon, there's the Cygnus. The European Space Agency had their resupply vehicles, which they have completed their contract on and aren't building anymore. JAXA continues to fly supplies as well, about once every other year. That the bulk of the supply is done by NASA and the Roscosmos. This was the first components went up in 1999. It has been continuously inhabited since November of 2020. It had a planned lifetime of 25 years. They're currently proposing to extend it to 30 years. There are significant structural components beginning to fail in this vehicle. The oldest components, like Zvezda, have cracks. They're 20 plus years old. They're past their warranty lifespan, and they represent a risk long-term to the station. So by 2030, this will be gone. There's an argument for saving some of the components that are younger, right? Specifically, these ones in the front, the European Space Agency components and JAXA components were flown much later, and so they could be moved on to another station, potentially. The solar panels are old enough now that there are actually replacement solar panels being installed over top of them. They're smaller and generate more electricity because technology has advanced. What's hard about the space station that most people don't think about is the fact that it is orbiting low enough that it spends 45 minutes in sunlight and 45 minutes in darkness, and all of its power is solar. So, how do you have power for the 45 minutes of darkness? Well, you're collecting solar power and you're charging batteries with it as well as operating the station, and then you go into darkness and switch fully over to battery for 45 minutes, and then you come back into sunlight and you kick back into solar, shift the power over to as much as solar, and start charging the batteries again. So imagine if you could drain and recharge your battery every 45 minutes, all day long, constantly, and if it fails, everybody dies. It's an expensive piece of technology to make that work. That's what's in this truss. All of these, the white panels are heat dispersers because you're charging these batteries so rapidly, they generate, just like you charging batteries rapidly, they generate a lot of heat. And getting rid of heat in space is hard. It's in a vacuum. So these white radiators are trying to disperse the heat. There are bigger ones in behind. Well, there they are right there, the three. Actually, I can use the pointer gizmo. Let's see if I can make that work. Ooh, look at that. Those are radiators. Those are radiators. So that charging backbone and all the battery packs that are inside of it are heavy, hot, and are wearing out. And we've been replacing components on them all along, but that's part of the limits for what's going to happen with the space station. NASA has recently put out a proposal for commercial space stations. They are not interested in operating a space station again, at least in low Earth orbit. So they are offering to buy time on commercial space stations. And a number of companies now are putting together proposals to build space stations that NASA can buy from and other people can buy from. So the same way that they commercialized resupplying this station and putting crews on this station, they want to commercialize the entire station process. So the folks at Blue Origin, the ones who've still not built their rocket, are working with a bunch of other companies to do this particular station called Orbital Reef. This is a much bigger version. The base Orbital Reef would be one of these components. This is about 3 of them. So this is a base component, and then you have a couple of add-ons and a docking port. That's all you'd really need to make a working station. That should be enough for 4 people to continuously inhabit. Again, learning from the station. The International Space Station design was based on a 4-meter format. That's what would fit inside of the Space Shuttle. This is based on a 6-meter format based on New Glenn, which is a larger rocket. So New Glenn's supposed to lift the primary components, so you'd have bigger barrel sections, more capacity. Each one of these base modules would be about 300 cubic meters of capacity. The entire International Space Station is 900 cubic meters. So just an idea, this is actually quite a large station. They're working with a couple of other companies, including Boeing, that makes the Starliner, which is the other crew ship that has not worked yet. And Sierra Space Systems builds that cool little winged vehicle that hasn't flown yet either. There are other companies working on other components. Genesis Engineering proposed this little gizmo, which I actually think is the best idea I've heard of all of the things they're doing here. This is basically a single-person spaceship, much like a space suit is, except that it's running in normal pressure for the space station, which is reduced for us, but allows you really to eliminate a lot of the time involved in doing a spacewalk. So you're using robotic hands, but you're at least in position, so you can see what you're working on and work from the robotic hands. Compared to current, both the Orlan and the American spacesuits, these take about 3 hours to get ready for. They have a much lower pressure because you're literally in a bubble. In order to have your hands work, you can't deal with normal station pressure. You'd never be able to bend your hands. So you pre-breathe pure oxygen for several hours while 2 people help you get into this suit. And then you can spacewalk for 6 to 8 hours in it. And that's the best we've got right now. So what Genesis is proposing, this would be ready in a few minutes. So you could quickly hop out, do something, and come back. Do a lot. There's a reason why spacewalks are so heavily planned. These are very fragile, also basically worn out. The same suits have been on the station since the beginning. So they're all mostly 20 years old and breaking. But all that stuff you saw in science fiction about an individual putting on a spacesuit and going outside, lies. Giant lies, right? If putting on a spacesuit is a complicated multi-person process, and making an individual spacesuit has been a mission for years that nobody's accomplished, that a suit that one person could put on and take off doesn't exist. The Lockheed Martin folks with nanoracks have proposed very inexpensive space stations. These would be man-tended stations, actually robotics. It's hard to see in this graphic, but there's these little floating nanobots around it for doing maintenance and controls on it. But you do have a docking port, so a person could go there to work temporarily, but not designed for long-duration missions. Because what are we going to do on a space station when we think about from a commercial perspective? For the most part, the International Space Station has been doing human science. We've been learning more about how humans function in space. And the answer now, after 20 years of working hard on it, is poorly. We know concretely now that the typical human well, actually not a typical human, a typical astronaut, which is far from a typical human, can last about 6 months on the space station without permanent harm done to them. That's only if they do 2.5 hours of exercise per day and a year's worth of rehabilitation when they come back down. There are parts of your body that don't function well in free fall. Like lots of things do work. All of your peristaltic systems work fine. Your blood pumps, you can digest food, that stuff works. One of the largest issues is your cerebral spinal fluid. So you have a pair of glands inside of your brain that produce a fluid that helps take detritus away from your brain, and it typically goes down your spine where it does exchange with your blood system to disperse those remnants into your kidneys. And it has no peristaltic system. It doesn't pump on its own. Now, nurses have known for bedridden patients for millennia that you sit up a bedridden patient every day to keep them healthy. And part of that is that cerebral spinal fluid is causing that fluid to actually circulate. You can't lay down all the time. You will be ill from it. In free fall, that fluid naturally doesn't go down your spine at all. So it builds up in your face, which is why whenever you see pictures of astronauts on the space station, their heads look a little puffy. Enough of that fluid builds up in your head over time that it starts pressing against the back of your eyes and it bends them. So you'll also notice that astronauts on the station all wear glasses. They have several different pairs and they change over the course of their mission as their eyes get more and more warped from the pressure of the cerebral spinal fluid. And it's one of the systems that takes the longest to recover from. So we're not going to other planets until we create artificial gravity. Now, the only way we know how to do artificial gravity is by creating rotating structures, which we've never done in space. So those are some of the experiments and why we would want multiple space stations. Right? There was a proposal to put a centrifuge on the International Space Station, but because it's mostly a microgravity experiment, they're like, hey, it's going to shake the whole station to have a centrifuge, so let's not do that. What would make more sense, and if we can reduce the cost on these things, is to have a station that does centrifuge work and a station that does microgravity work and so on. Multiple smaller stations that can do the different tasks that we actually need to learn from in space. The company furthest along for building another station is Axiom. So I talked about Axiom had just flown their first mission to the International Space Station as a tourist mission. They have a agreed upon contract to add components onto the International Space Station over the next few years. They're going to pay for them with tourism. So now there'll be like a tourism wing to the International Space Station. And with the plan that once they get the 4 modules together, they can build their own free-flying space station from it. So build the initial components connected to the space station, and the space station provides power and station keeping control. And then once you've got sufficient components up, you bring up your own command control component and make your own station from it. So the guys behind Axiom are formal space station NASA techs. They know what they're doing. They actually have an agreed upon contract, and they are cutting metal for the first component that will go onto the International Space Station. So this looks to be real. I don't know if they're going to run out of money or not. Space is expensive, but they certainly have the skilled people in place. So likely the first space station we'll see after the International Space Station will be the Axiom Space Station. All right, well, the last time we got left, let's talk a little bit about the moon. This is my favorite picture of the moon. It's a weird picture. My rule whenever I see cool pictures like this is say, who took this picture? Because that's a funny location to be in. I mean, clearly it's a picture of the far side of the moon, not the dark side of the moon, because it's not dark. It's lit at that moment. When you see a new moon up in the sky, you know the other side is lit, right? This is the far side of the moon. This is a real photograph. This was taken by the Deep Space Observatory. It's actually a solar weather space satellite, and it's sitting in the L1, the Lagrange point 1, between the Earth and the Sun. And it mostly takes pictures of the Sun. But somebody was smart enough to put a telescope on the back of it pointed at the Earth. Because it sits in that Lagrange point, it always has a full disk view of the Earth. And it is a telescope it's put on, because it's 1.5 million kilometers from the Earth. So the Earth is very small. But it takes those pictures almost continuously. Now, because it's a space camera, it only takes those pictures in, it isn't a full color lens or sensor. It's a single color sensor, but they have different filters they put in front of it. So in order to make a full color picture like this, they actually take 4 pictures. Which is why you know this picture is real, because if you got really close to this, you'd notice on the edge of the moon here, there's a little green haze. And that's because the green filtered picture was taken last, and the moon moved because the moon whips through this frame. It's only there for a little while. So even though it only takes about 3 minutes for the observatory to take this picture, I mean, it's 4 separate frames. They're far enough apart that you actually have the motion distortion caused by that. But yeah, cool picture of the moon. So the Apollo missions went to the moon. Of course, U.S. President Kennedy in '62, we choose to go to the moon. He was mostly saying that because it was the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, needed to distract people. It worked. He got to go all the way to the moon, or really only because he got shot and killed, and so they had to go because now the president was dead. 12 men went to the moon. 11 of them were military test pilots. In case you weren't sure that Apollo was a military mission, it was. The only guy who was not a military test pilot, the guy in the bottom right, Jack Schmitt, he was a geologist. He was supposed to be on Apollo 17, or Apollo 18, but they canceled Apollo 18, so they bumped him up to 17 so at least they could fly one scientist. And he was a geologist. And you can tell because he's got geology all over him. Few things to note about Jack. He was a scientist, so he was interested in the science to the point where, I mean, everything they ever did on the moon, they actually have published. So you can watch YouTube videos of Jack Schmitt walking on the moon. He kept lifting that gold visor up so you could see the rocks better, because geologist, right? And of course, he ran the risk that if he looked at the sun, it would literally destroy his eyes instantly. And so Capcom, who could see him on these different camera shots every so often, would realize he had his visor up and would say, hey, you know, Jack, when you get a sec, would you put your visor down, please? Now, Jack didn't want to put his visor down because he really wanted to look at the rocks. So he started tearing off his safety cards, which are the things on his left arm, in case ofs. He started tearing them off and stuffing them into his helmet. That's what this stuff is up here. That's his sunshade made from cards because he's going to leave his visor up. He wants to look at the rocks. I like scientists. You know, he has his priorities right. I'm on the moon and I want to look at the rocks. And he found more important rocks than all those test pilots combined, because science is not found by Eureka. Science is found by, what the hell is that? And he knew enough about rocks to know, what the hell is that rock? And that's what he found by lifting his visor and stuffing those things in and looking for it. If we put scientists on the moon, there's stuff for us to know. We only did it once for 3 days. And he kicked ass. We could do a lot more. The biggest problem with the moon missions, of course, was this thing. The Lunar Excursion Module was the absolute limit of technologies in the 1960s. There was about a dozen known failure modes for this vehicle that were not survivable. It had enough materials to keep 3 people alive, or 2 people alive for 3 days, and it took at least 3 days to launch a replacement mission for them. So there was no way to save these guys if anything went wrong. That's why they stopped flying. It wasn't worth the risk. Right? This was a military mission to prove American technology over Soviet technology. They succeeded. Stop it before you screw it up. And that's essentially what happened. Right? They used up the other parts on other missions. But we need a better landing system. It's just not good enough. So NASA's approach to going back to the moon is to build a space station around the moon first. There's a few good reasons why to do this. This is called the Lunar Gateway. One is they want a do-over. They want to build a better space station, because they made a bunch of mistakes in the International Space Station. The other is that this will also be an International Space Station. ESA is committed to contributing a component. Canada's going to do robot arms because that's what we do. Japan wants to supply a component as well. And of course, when you supply components, it means you get to go to the moon too. But there's a big reason why you do international missions like this, because then it becomes a treaty agreement between countries, which means an individual country can't cancel the project. Right? So by making a deal this way and getting them to commit to that, the chances of this actually getting built go up dramatically. The first component's actually currently under construction. This piece here, which is the station keeping component, this is a Maxor, the most powerful Hall effect thruster system ever. So that should be able to maintain station keeping on the station, because the station is going to have a very unusual orbit. It's called a near rectilinear halo orbit. I have an animation. Diane Davis from the NASA Johnson created this animation of what the orbit looks like. So it's a little hard to understand what's going on here, but the orbit is not just going to go around the moon. What it's actually going to do is orbit north to south and have a very long stroke below and close up above. So the actual orbit period is about a week before you get back to the same point. You pass close over the North Pole and you fly distant over the South Pole. So you spend most of your time looking back at the moon on the South Pole, which is where we want to focus our attention anyway. Now, why have this wacky orbit? It needs the least amount of station keeping. You have the fewest problems that way. So, and it also is an orbit that will always be in view of the Earth, so you have continuous communications, and always in view of the sun, so you don't need as many batteries. You have enough electricity to run all the time. Simpler, more reliable station. This would be a man-tended station. You would stay on it for a month or two before going home, but it would be able to be operated on its own with nobody on it, which is not true of the International Space Station. If there's nobody on the International Space Station, it's in danger. It needs people maintaining it in person. This would be a simpler station that can cope without that. There's a proposal for SpaceX to do resupply with it using Falcon Heavy. That is a resupply component for the space station. So the same kind of model, trying to reduce costs and make this a sustainable approach. The other reason to have a space station is it gets you proximate to the moon. You've done most of the work of getting there without doing the really hard part of landing on the moon. We need a reusable vehicle to operate on the moon up and down. So maintaining a vehicle here that you can then fly to the surface of the moon and back again makes a lot more sense. So you would you put your supplies here, you stage your people here, and then you do a mission to the surface. We're colored by our view from Apollo of put everything together, fly it once, use it once, throw it all away. Right? If you actually want to sustain operations on the moon, you have to be more efficient than that. And so the gateway is a part of that process. We stage all your supplies and so forth for a trip onto the surface of the moon from the gateway, and then you take a vehicle from the gateway to the surface and back up again. About 2 years ago, they put together proposals for actually what those vehicles would look like. These are the three companies that got to actually mature their proposals: Dynetics, SpaceX, and the national team, which was Blue Origin, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Draper together. The Dynetics mission was pretty cool. It was almost a self-contained vehicle. There's outside tanks that have to be dropped on a landing, but it'll have enough fuel to take off again. So otherwise, you just replace the tanks each time you wanted to fly it. But when they actually reviewed the proposal for the Dynetics mission, they found a situation they call negative mass, which is your vehicle is heavier than it could actually fly. So yeah, you made up some numbers here that don't work. So that's not happening. They've got to solve some problems on that. The national mission is not one disposable stage like the old lunar module, but two disposable stages. There's a transport stage, which is just a big fuel tank and engine for doing the initial entry burn, and then you drop that. And then the upper parts, this is the landing component, and this is the return module. So the only thing you'd get back up to the station would be the ascent module. The rest would be left behind. And then you'd have to fly up new components each time you wanted to fly it. Now, if you're going to build a base on the moon, if every time you fly there, you leave stuff behind, it makes it hard to build a base, right? It's like you drive a car to a place and then you leave the car. And then you drive another car to the place. Like eventually, it's a big parking lot. So the only one with an actual proposal for a fully reusable vehicle is SpaceX. This was one of the pictures that the national team put together of what their big lander would look like. You notice how tall that ladder is? And so it's a bit of a falling risk, without a doubt. Actually, the most important thing in this picture is that guy kneeling, because Apollo astronauts could not kneel. You couldn't bend your knee that far. Remember, the suit is pressurized, right? So you physically cannot bend the suit that far. That's why when you saw them tip over, they sort of had to pop themselves back up again. 1/6 gravity is great for that. I think this may be a lie. Like building a kneelable suit is a harder problem than you think. SpaceX's solution is Starship. So yeah, a 60-meter tall vehicle. That's why it's this picture. They're going to need an elevator because this is the part with the people in it. This is the part with the fuel in it, and you need to be down here. So yeah, it's a big ride down. Also, find level ground, because if this tips over, you'll have problems. I don't like any of these proposals, right? But this at least is fully reusable. So you can take off again, you can refuel it, like that. At least they won the resupply, the landing mission. because it is at least fully reusable. It has exceptional capacity. It's just got its own problems. I think they should be building assemble a lander. Like take the volume you've got here, but make it large and flat and modular. So you can swap out components if you want to. And keep it close to the ground, because that's where people want to go anyway. Put the tanks on the sides. Part of all of this singing and dancing around is to deal with gravity problems. So we've now, if you ever watch the original lunar landing, the Apollo 11, it's about a half hour from when Eagle separates from Columbia and begins to burn to go to the surface of the moon. And that half hour, they start on the far side of the moon to land on the near side. All of the missions for Apollo landed on the near side of the moon, so they could stay in contact with the Earth, and they were in sunlight. So they had timed things very, very precisely to land where they wanted to land. They still had an ellipsis of landing that was several kilometers across, but they'd done very careful timing of how long it was going to take. You burn this engine this much, it's going to take this long to descend, then you do the additional corrections and landing. And they were wrong. And if you listen to that half hour, you'll hear Neil Armstrong. You know, this is some of the dead reckoning. They don't have GPS. It's the 1960s, and you're at the moon. But they've got a detailed map of the moon, so they know what landmarks to watch for and when they should pass each one based on their calculations. And so within about 5 minutes of their burn, Neil says, we're long. They're passing the markers they're expecting to pass too soon. And so by the time they get to the point where they're supposed to land, they have overshot the clear, safe landing site. And the automatic computer is about to land them in an area with house-sized boulders, the kind that knock your ship over and kill you. And that's why Neil takes manual control and flies away from the boulders and lands manually with 10 seconds of fuel to spare. I mean, like it was a movie, but that's actually what happened. So the reason, and since then, in the 90s, we put together this GRAIL mission that precisely measured the gravity on the moon. And we saw variances of plus or minus 2%. There are mass concentrations on the moon. So this is a map of the variations in the gravity. And that's why they were long. They were flying over some heavy gravity sites that pulled the vehicle faster than expected. And it's also why we need that weird orbit for the gateway. If you put something in a low orbit around the moon, you will lose it within a month or so. The variations in gravity will eventually force you down and you'll collide with the moon. And so we have these maps now. Part of our challenge of using a base, of actually having a location on the moon to land at regularly, is being able to know those gravitational paths. So we know exactly how much acceleration we're going to be affected by. But we're getting better. We understand that map in more detail. The Europeans, of course, are solving it by GPS on the moon. So an array of satellites that would cover all angles of the moon, that would be both a navigation system and cellular communications. So it didn't matter where you are on the moon, you'd be able to communicate back. It's about 16 satellites in total that need to be put up there. It's a very feasible project, and it is infrastructure for the moon. If we really want to operate from there, having an array like that would work. These would actually have mollinear orbits, or that same kind of irregular orbit, so that they don't have orbital problems, but there's enough of them that there's enough in range, you're always able to calculate location and have communications. And so, yeah, we could build out a base on the moon. This is one of the graphics that SpaceX produced of them landing on the moon. This is their idea of a base on the moon, which looks suspiciously like Burning Man. Actually, I looked at it. I remembered a TV show called Space 1999. Remember Moon Base Alpha? Yeah. So it kind of looks like that, really. But more realistically, because of the radiation levels, we will be burying our habitats. This is actually, remember that paper I talked about, Reading Wave, at the beginning that led to the moon base talk? This was in that proposal, was using robots to you land an inflatable housing unit, and then you use robots to bury it in a meter of regolith for radiation protection. It's not sexy, but it's practical. Even more practical than this would be skylights. So in the active periods of the moon's creation, there were volcanoes and there were volcanic eruptions and floods. The gravity's too low to have cinder cones, so you don't really see that, but you did have lava running through lava tubes and then breaking up on the surface and creating the mares, the big flat basaltic areas. Well, some of these lava tubes have collapse points in them they call skylights. Because the gravity is so low, these lava flows left behind tubes that are 20 to 30 meters in diameter. And so when they break through the surface, they have a great big opening. So there's one called the Marius Skylight that the Japanese Space Agency wants to put a probe down into. But the most logical place for us to build a base is inside one of those lava tubes at a skylight point. Take your inflatable, get it through that hole, inflate it up into the walls. You have nice, thick, robust walls, protection from meteorites, protection from radiation, and it's got a skylight. So you got a way in and out, and you land nearby. So again, not going to be like the movies, but imminently practical and absolutely feasible technology for us to do. So the momentum has died down since the government in the US has changed for reasonable reasons, but technology continues to evolve and the cost of space flight is down. The 2,000 a kilo number stays and maybe gets better. And that opens the door to so many more different kinds of flights that it makes space flight to the moon far more practical. Right? We have actually made an advance in the past 10 years, and it's that cost of flight. That actually makes a difference for how we approach a lot of these things. So as much as the moon seems like flight's of fancy or science fiction, many of these pieces are actually in place for us to go forward with that. If you like talks like this, a shortcut to all those geekouts I made is this URL, geekout.show. Will take you to a filtered list of the .NET Rocks episodes that we call geekouts, including the 3 I did at the beginning of the year. One of them was more or less this talk. And thanks for your time.